Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Rosenthal from the Petrarch Institute, your home for classical learning. I'm here once again with my friend and colleague of many years, Dr. Miles Smith. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody listening live and joining us recorded around the world. It's great to have you with us. My name is Miles Smith. I'm co-founder with Alex of the Petrarch Institute. Alex, what are we here to do today?
Yeah, so what we are doing is beginning a series on golden ages in history. So I hope it is quite interesting. I think Miles sort of came up with the original idea that it would be kind of interesting to do sort of a long panoramic view over, over a number of different video sessions discussing some of the great achievements in human history. Do you want to say anything else about that?
Absolutely. So here at the Petrarch Institute, we're interested in sharing and capturing and crystallizing some of the great legacies of classical civilization out of the conviction that they offer a great deal for those of us living in the modern world. And so our objective in all of our courses is to take themes such as the virtues or rhetoric and help explain in very accessible terms what the greats from the ancient and medieval and Renaissance worlds can teach us, and also to help share the power that they have in helping to build character and form our lives in the modern world. And we realized that it would be useful to paint a kind of cogent picture of what some of the highlights are of the golden ages through the world. And certainly to give a sense of how there might be some commonalities to tie them all together, some things that thread them together for the makings of a strong civilization, which in turn feeds into the well-beings of a strong and independent individual. Would you say that's right, Alex?
Absolutely. And although I would say our focus, and will be the focus in this series, would be on Western civilization, both because it is the area which I am best able to discourse on, but also because I think there are thematic unities and recurring themes within a civilization that allows for an easier picture to be presented pedagogically to the audience. I thought it would be a good idea to begin with one of the most famous golden ages, which is actually, in these sessions we'll be more focused on the developments in the Asian continent, which is the Axial Age. So should I guess I should begin then with just describing what that is, no?
Yes, that's a phrase that is used a lot by academics, but some of our audience may not have heard the phrase, Alex. The Axial Age, a period that still lives with us in many ways, but is one remote in immediate memory, remote in history, and it's associated with a couple of thinkers, and two of those that our audience might have heard of, I think, Alex, are Jaspers and Dawson. Is that not so?
Yeah, essentially, yes. I mean, the term the Axial Age really comes from Karl Jaspers in a book he wrote on the origin and goal of history and other works of his. And basically, what Jaspers is trying to do, so I think the idea of an axis is fairly clear, right? The Earth rotates on an axis, right? It's the thing on which everything turns, right? And I think actually the idea of axial events is rather familiar to us, even if we don't know it, because almost all the calendars used in the world are centered on some axial event, right? So in the Western calendar, the birth of Christ is the axis of our notion of time, right? We divide time basically into BC and AD, right? An axial event. Or the Islamic calendar on the Hijra and so forth, right? The Jewish calendar on the traditional date for the creation of the world, right? So axial events divide time in most of the major civilizations. What Jaspers was kind of interested in is there sort of an axial era in universal history, right? That everybody can, regardless of faith, could look to and say, yes, that is the case. Now, whether or not we accept Jaspers' approach to it, almost everybody acknowledges that the period that he locates between 800 BC to 200 BC was a period of extraordinary developments, right? And from Jaspers' point of view, everything which has happened since is basically derivative, and so virtually everything is essentially derivative from the events that were going on there, right? So during this period, you have a period of remarkable achievements across the length of Eurasia, right? So in China, it's the age of Confucius and Lao Tzu, right? In India, it's the age of Buddha and important developments in Hinduism. It's the age of the Hebrew prophets, and it's the development of the classical civilization in ancient Greece with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, right? So it's an important transformative epoch. Dawson uses a different terminology. He talks about the rise of the world religions, right? Which he distinguishes from the archaic religions. So maybe I'll just say a couple of words about what are some of the characteristics that I think one can look at, drawing on Dawson and other historians, to distinguish the axial age from the pre-axial age. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, that'd be useful.
Okay, so I would say you have basically three things. One is that in all of these civilizations, there is the discovery of some type of ultimate reality underlying the world, right? So in the archaic, what Dawson calls the archaic religions are essentially based upon nature worship and the worship of natural forces, which nature suggests multiplicity. There are many natural forces. There's wind, there's sky, there's earth, etc., right? In the axial age, across all these civilizations, there's some sense of some universal or ultimate reality, and the sense that our relationship to that reality is the most important thing that there is. Secondly, there is a new ethical focus. In all of these civilizations, we have the first stirrings of the sense of a universal ethic instead of merely a tribalist ethic, right? Transcending the group. What happens also is that in all of these civilizations, whether you think of the Chinese classics, the Indian classics, the Greek classics, the Hebrew Bible, right? In all of these, we're having the formation of what we could say the formative spiritual traditions of all of these different civilizations, right? The ones that are constantly looked back on, as well as great personages, right? Confucius, Buddha, Socrates, Isaiah. And one last point that I would make is Dawson points out that the period of the rise of the world religion was almost entirely about spiritual and intellectual shifts, right? The archaic age was the age which saw a huge amount of material progress. The agricultural revolution, right, which he sees as very linked to these nature, the birth of the cities, right, which was again very religiously focused, right. Each city has its own god, and the priest kings who rule them, right, are entirely focused on the archaic religions, right. So And it's worthwhile to note that about half of the recorded history of the human race had passed by the time we get to the axial age, right? So we don't want to completely discount the notion that anything happened before. And nonetheless, the spiritual transformations that occurred, spiritual and intellectual transformations that occurred during this period remain to this day of immense importance in understanding our contemporary world. Yeah, go on.
So that's a tremendous overview, Alex. One of the things that the audience will have picked up in your picture there is that there is a recognizable pattern happening in parallel at this Cartesian origin for culture, so to speak, in a number of different centers with some common forces in play, be it agriculture and then urbanization, the dawning of universal notions, etc. But each of them draw on some material and cultural and social and economic preconditions, which, although similar, are local and different. So is there a way to look at how this plays out uniquely, for example, in Asia?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I would say if we consider Asia in the broad sense, which includes Western Asia or the Middle East, right? Basically, all of the major world religions that are practiced today, including far outside of Asia, right, stem from this period and from this locales. But what I was thinking of doing was sort of starting in the Far East and working our way west, just to give us a geographic logo. So I thought we would start with China, if that makes some sense. So I guess what I would begin with, we'll talk in this session about China. So the Chinese civilization, as we know, is a very ancient, right? Going back perhaps, I mean, the earliest attested dynasty is the Shang dynasty, which goes back to perhaps 1700 BC. So it's already, you know, a very ancient civilization. And what follows is the Chu dynasty, right? And China's always had this perennial issue: how do we hold all this large expanse of territory, which shares sort of a common culture, together? The Chu dynasty, unfortunately, did not do that particularly well. And it comes to a period called the Spring and Autumn period, where China essentially breaks up into mini-states. They're not that many, but they're more mini than it was, right? And it's in this period which is really our axial age of China, right? So running from about 770 to 476, so 722 to 476, and it's in this period where we have the great figure of Confucius, right? Who is, you know, at various points a government official, but he devoted the majority of his life to teaching and to itinerant teaching, right, going from place to place, under the idea that what China needed was, you know, a great moral reform more than anything else. And, you know, it's interesting, Confucius presents his teaching as really a return to more ancient values, but it's in the form that Confucius understood them that they exercised the most influence. Now, it should be said, and there were other figures who followed him, like Mencius and so forth, but it should be mentioned that the ride was not entirely smooth. The emperor who unifies China, Shi Huangdi, is also infamous for his persecution of Confucianism and the burning of the books. You know, turning again, he's a legalist, and he doesn't like Confucius's ideas about how rulers should rule more by moral example than by sort of a coercive force and so forth. He's a great believer in the stick, we could say. And Confucianism is sort of driven underground during this brief period, about 220 to 210, sort of driven underground. But afterwards, Confucianism's fortunes simply seem to continue to rise. So in the next dynasty, in 195 BC, the Emperor Cao begins building temples to Confucius, and it becomes sort of the state religion, right? In the way that you know, maybe an analogy would be the way Constantine makes Catholicism the state religion of the Roman Empire. And this is important in the Tang dynasty in the 8th century. China essentially becomes a kind of meritocracy where everyone can take the civil service exam, and depending on how you do, that determines your place in the government hierarchy and so forth, right? And so an immersion in the Confucian classics becomes the entire basis for advancement within the Chinese system. This is basically the Chinese imperial system up until the 20th century. And I think if we think about the values that one associates with China and the parts of Asia which Chinese culture has influenced: education, family, respect for authority, and so forth, right? I mean, these kinds of values really come from the Confucian origins of Chinese culture and these 2,500 years of immersion in its texts. And although under the communist rule of Mao Zedong there was an effort to sort of purge Confucius and Confucianism from China, it did not really work, right? There's been in recent years something of a return to Confucius. And you look at figures like Lee Kuan Yew, was sort of emphasizing when he talked about, you know, Asian values, and this was the recently passed Lee Kuan Yew was a man who turned Singapore from a very poor country to one of the wealthiest countries in the world. He talks about the importance of Asian values, which are really these Confucian values of, you know, social hierarchy, of education, of respect for elders and authority, and these sort, and you know, respect for the community and so forth. Right? These are really the values that he was referring to. So I think even today we can see the enduring importance of Confucian values if we want to understand what's going on in that part of the world. So should I say a little bit then about what Confucius actually taught, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Alex, because at this point, one of the questions that will be rising to the mind is, you know, people can understand the relevance of the whole system in terms of cultivating a prosperous, a healthy, and a productive society, especially if you look at the latter-day example of Lee Kuan Yew, who's sort of a towering figure in the Asian firmament in the modern world, using an ancient body of teaching to mint an extremely modern success story in an Asian idiom. But are there some particular ingredients, some particular formatory patterns that led to the pinnacle of this Confucian model? In other words, what did it look like as it sort of ascended and bore fruit?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think you hit the key point, which sort of got at Jaspers' point about the axial age, the fact that we're constantly returning back to the axial age figures, right? And it's no matter how much China at points in the 20th century felt modernization meant turning its back on its Confucian heritage, it's never, you know, there is this constant, as we see with Lee Kuan Yew, right, this constant turning back. So Confucius's sayings were recorded. You know, perhaps the most important of the Confucian classics are the Analects of Confucius, which are basically a collection of ethical maxims by the master, as it were. He's always referred to as the master. And so some of these key ideas. Okay, so we could just look at some of the sayings. One of the things that comes through is this great confidence in the power of education to change people, right, and to make them more virtuous, right. So he writes, "It is these things that cause me concern: failure to cultivate virtue, failure to go deeply into what I have learned, inability to move up to what I have heard to be right, and inability to reform myself when I have defects," right? So we see there, I think, a great importance given to virtue, to education as the means of getting there, to self-examination, right? I think those virtues kind of come through. Now, one of the most famous sayings from the Analects is something that may sound almost familiar. Se Kung asked, "Is there a single word one may live by?" The master answered, "Is not reciprocity such a word? What you do not wish done to yourself, do not do to others," right? It's sometimes thought of as the Chinese formulation of the Golden Rule, or the Silver Rule, as it's sometimes called, because the emphasis is on not harming others. So there's this great emphasis on benevolence, right? How one treats others, and using how one would want to be treated as the reference point. Now, another thing which is very famous in China is the strength of the family and reverence for elders, right? Which is very strongly inculcated and extends to reverence for the ancestral. You look at someone like Roger Scruton today, right, in Britain. He talks about the importance of Confucian values, right, the sort of reverence for ancestral tradition that you got there, you know, sort of a conservative value, right? Confucius wrote, "When your father is alive, observe his will. When your father is dead, observe his former actions. If for 3 years after the death of your father you do not change from the ways of your father, you may be called a real son," right? So this extreme emphasis on reverence for elders and ancestors, even after their passing, is, I think, one of the distinctive features of Chinese culture. Now, in the modern times, people sometimes think of Confucius as a somewhat secular figure, right? They think of it as sort of a secular figure of ethics. But Dawson, in particular, emphasizes the piety that comes through in the Confucian classics, right? So Confucius wrote that he who sins against heaven has nothing to whom he can pray, right? So in a sense, Confucius is imagining a kind of hierarchy reaching up to heaven, right? And of course, rulers rule by the mandate of heaven, right? And the need to uphold ethical principles in every stage. He talked about, right, when we see men of worth, we should think of equaling them. When we see men of a contrary character, we should turn inwards and examine ourselves. So again, that strong emphasis on self-examination. There's a strong emphasis on social harmony, and Confucianism, we have to say, is kind of a hierarchical system, right? It's about everybody doing their duty in their place, right? So he says there is government when the prince is prince, when the minister is minister, when the father is father, and the son is son. So everybody understanding their place and doing the duties of their station is going to be very central to Confucianism. But at the same time, he's going to emphasize strongly, if you want to keep the mandate of heaven, as it were, right, the moral responsibility of rulership, right, and not to overburden the people with laws and cow them with your authority, right? So this is probably what the legalists didn't like particularly. So he wrote, if you govern the people legalistically and control them by punishment, they will avoid crime but have no personal sense of shame. If you govern them by means of virtue and control them with propriety, they will gain their own sense of shame and thus correct themselves, right? So we could see why Confucianism was easily turned to a philosophy of government that you would want officials to understand, right? Because of its inculcation of the sense of moral and ethical responsibility that comes with power. So I think those are basically the concepts the key concepts that I would see, at least, in Confucianism. Were there any thoughts on that or anything you want to add?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you helped start the introduction to this whole concept by saying that it's good to remember that before the Axial Age, there was a period of material productivity that helped pave the way. And you've painted a pretty lustrous and compelling picture of Confucius as someone who contributed something so towering that it continues to shape Asian cultures and the relationship, I think, between Asian societies today. And so we have a great sense of what Confucius contributed, what he has to say to instruct both citizens and rulers down to this day. Are there some ingredients that he drew on, some crucial things that you think made the moment ripe for someone like him?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things about the, I mean, first of all, the whole notion of the mandate of heaven predates Confucius, right? So one of the interesting things about the Axial Age is that many of them felt that they were returning, right? That they were not innovators, but taking the best aspects of existing traditions and giving them, special emphasis. But I think another thing to point out is also that many of these figures, certainly when we get to the prophets of Israel, right, these are figures of crisis, moments of crisis, right? And this is very true of Confucius as well, because the unity of China has been broken, right? And these divided feudal lords, right, will soon end in the chaos of warfare and conflict. And Confucius is going to see this, all of these issues, as symptoms of a kind of failure to keep, let's say, the ways of the ancients, right? Like a sort of moral kind of corruption, right? That requires moral reform. So I think in those two ways, the preceding epochs were fruitful both for providing some of the key concepts that Confucius could draw on, as well as the fact that it was a period of crisis, and periods of crisis often lead people to look back on what resources can be found in the past or in new interpretations of the past, to rectify the situations that are contemporary. Right, and I think you see this as well. We were talking about Asian values and Lee Kuan Yew and so forth, right? I mean, you see this today as well, right? People looking now to Confucius as this ancient figure for ways to address the problems of today.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it points to another key issue, I think, perhaps in play with Confucius is, as with a lot of the first-tier great figures, they contribute a great deal in the form of teaching or a body of work or leadership and so on. But they also help create a type. And it would really seem that Confucius, in his setting, helps create the type of the sage. And there are a couple of others. Some of our audience may have heard of Mencius, but certainly a great many will have heard of Lao Tzu.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to realize, right, Confucianism was not the only formative tradition in China, although I think you could argue it is the most central, because it received the most sanction. But the Taoist tradition is also extremely important, and I think it is in Taoism where we see, especially like I had mentioned, this fact that during the Axial Age, people were thinking of the idea of some sort of unity underlying, let's say, the world of nature and the world of multiplicity and so forth. And this is really the theme of the Tao Te Ching, right? So in the Tao Te Ching, it says the Tao is called the Great Mother, empty yet inexhaustible. It gives birth to infinite worlds, right? So it's this idea of this creative principle, the single eternal creative principle at the root of nature, right? And by sort of following the way of nature, one comes to a kind of peace, tranquility, it's sort of the model for the good life. And I think also the more mystical element in the Chinese temperament is perhaps best expressed in Taoism and later in Buddhism, which we'll talk about under India. The fact that the ultimate reality transcends all concepts, right? So the very beginning of the Tao Te Ching says the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The unnameable is the eternally real. So it's this idea that the ultimate reality sort of transcends human concepts or anything we can grasp. And I think it's quite typical of the Asian religions to have a kind of mystical orientation in the sense that it's by direct experience more than by words, language, and concepts that one approaches the highest realities. So I would say, so I think that is sort of an important other element within the Chinese cultural context.
Good. Any concluding thoughts, Alex, do you want to leave the audience with as a way to summarize what this Far Eastern component of the Axial Age is all about?
Yeah, well, I think, again, that if you want to understand the cultures of the Far East as they continue to develop, and I think also that we can see also in Confucius and in all the Axial Age figures things which have universal merit and value. So it's really the Confucian tradition we can think of as a form of Asian humanism, right? Dawson actually thinks of Confucianism as the closest thing to the European classical tradition of Greece and Rome, in the sense of there's kind of a confidence in the ability to change, reform, and educate human beings through the cultivation of ethics and the study of a classical tradition. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of fruit to be gained, not only from this anthropological standpoint of studying Far Eastern cultures, but also in terms of universal values which they contain that I think everyone can profit from.
That is a beautiful segue, Alex, into basically an encapsulation of what Petrarch Institute is all about. So the audience should know that in the future we'll be building out this series of podcasts with other aspects of golden ages and highlights of civilization. But Alex, did you want to tell people about the offerings of the Petrarch Institute that are coming up?
Yeah, well, I can tell you what is in the works. So, I mean, we always have a course offering on the virtues, right? It's going to deal with the Greek classical tradition, particularly on the notion of virtue. But we're also working on a new course on Nietzsche and Socrates. Right, so I think two central figures in the Western philosophical tradition with contrasting views on the nature of ethics. I think that should be very interesting. We're trying to develop a course on Greek drama and the development of the literary traditions of classical Greece, as well as a course on the Renaissance. So those are some of the things which we hope to be coming down the pike shortly. And if anyone is interested, always feel free to contact me at alex.rosenthal@petrarch-institute.com. So I hope you enjoy.
I'd also like, oh, sorry about that. I'd like to mention that people can also connect with us on Twitter. So if you're interested in what we're talking about, there are many people interested in classics, the humanities, and things like that on Twitter. And the Petrarch Institute, you can find us at Petrarch Center, CENTRE, is among them. So we look forward to meeting you where and as your interests dictate.
Outstanding. Okay, thank you very much.
Look forward to seeing you all next time.
Bye.